Will you be remembered after you're dead? The Z-List Deadlist podcast about obscure people from history with me, Iszi Lawrence.
Well, Spitfires were the most lovely airplanes. Anybody will tell you who's flown them. They were part of you when you got into them. They were an aircraft strapped to you. When you moved, it seemed to move. It was very manoeuvrable, this way, that way, fore and aft. The later ones, as they got heavier and they got more weight in front, were not so attractive fore and aft. But the earlier ones were light and dainty, and they were lovely things to fly, beautiful things to fly. And they didn't have very good visibility. You had a nose up in front. You just saw a little bit out here and a little bit out there. But basically, they were the most beautiful aircraft.
You've just heard one of my all-time heroes, a hero I didn't even know about until last year. Hello, I am Iszi Lawrence. I'm the host of the Z-List Deadlist podcast. I don't particularly like describing myself as a host because it makes me sound like I've got fleas. However, Diana Barnato Walker, who is the lady you just heard, I didn't even know she existed until last year, and when I found out about her and I read her autobiography, my mind was entirely blown. It was only down to the fact that I was writing this children's book. It's a book called Billie Swift Takes Flight. It is out in September, and it is about the Air Transport Auxiliary. I know, that thing that children just love, Air Transport Auxiliary. What it is, it's the civilian wing of the RAF. Does that make sense? It's basically a civilian sort of transport auxiliary. I'm explaining this so well. They're the people who delivered the planes for the RAF. So you had the factories, you had the RAF air bases. These are warplanes, and they need to be delivered fresh from the factory to the airbase to be kitted out. And also they need to be taken from the air bases where they've been damaged, where they've been shot up, where their engines have been failing, where they've got leaks, carbon monoxide poisonings happening to the pilots. All of that, they've got to be transported back to a place where they can get repaired, away from the action. And of course, the RAF don't use their pilots for this because the pilots are a bit busy. There is a war on. So they use the civilian wing called the ATA, the Air Transport Auxiliary. Affectionately, it was called the Ancient and Tattered Airmen because a lot of the pilots were the ones who couldn't get jobs in the RAF because they wore glasses or they were too old or disabled. Keith Jopp only had one arm and one eye. He was still flying Spitfires around the place. You had women as well. I mean, women were a large part of this. I think they made up, a fifth or a sixth of the pilots were all female because, in the 1930s, very well-to-do women could afford to fly aircraft, and they jolly well did. So you had people like Amy Johnson being a famous pilot of the 1930s, flew to Australia, flew to America, broke world records with her husband. She was a huge big deal, and she actually died in the Second World War flying for the ATA. She made a mistake. She was flying, and when I say she made a mistake, she really didn't. She flew to instruction because you have to remember these planes were flying from factories. A lot of them hadn't been kitted out with radio, and so the ATA was instructed never to use radio. They'd never used it. They used ordnance survey maps, which they had with them, which they'd fold out and have a look at. That's what they used to navigate with, as well as their eyes. And once they were up, they were up. They were also flying planes that they weren't always familiar with, but we'll get onto that later. Amy Johnson was meant to be flying her plane to Oxford, and the weather set in where it was thick fog. She couldn't see where she was going. She could navigate a little bit because she knew her airspeed and she knew the direction she was going in because she had a compass, but she couldn't physically see the land beneath her, and she was running out of fuel. She knew she must have overshot Oxford. Does she dive down, hopefully not hit a hill and see a field last minute and try and land it, or does she do the sensible thing, which is what she did do, which is, eject out of the plane, allow the plane to crash, and at least then, it takes a lot more time to train a pilot than it does to build an aircraft. So pilots are more important than aircraft. So she ejected out of the plane, and of course she wasn't above land. She was above the Thames estuary, and she went straight in the Thames estuary. There was a boat there who came to rescue her, and the captain even dived in to save her, but by the time he got to her, she was nearly frozen. And of course they they tried to turn the boat around, and they both got dragged underneath. So that was the end of Amy Johnson, absolute hero for female aviation. Very similar to Amelia Earhart, if you've heard of her, that sort of gung-ho spirit. But Amy Johnson wasn't the only person, the only woman flying for the ATA. And like I said, I had a huge amount of fun reading these autobiographies and listening to all of these interviews of these women. But the best biography I've read, the ultimate nerd favourite, has to be Diana Barnato Walker. I mean, Diana's name is interesting because Barnato, which is her maiden name, is taken from her grandfather, but it's not a traditional name. He was, I think his last name was actually Isaacs, and he was Barnett Isaacs, and he began life in the East End of London. He was a tradesman and a juggler. He would make money with his brother doing juggling acts in the streets, and they were both asked to do musical. Now, Barnett, he clearly fancied himself as a serious actor, so he was playing Othello. This is what he wanted to do, a soliloquy to the audience where he played Othello. Bear in mind that Othello is usually, well, he's a Moorish character. He's meant to be dark-skinned and rugged, and this was a teenage boy who was quite reedy with glasses and blonde hair, like really blonde, from a Jewish background, playing to a largely Jewish audience. And his family began to titter quite quickly at this straight acting, and soon he had the entire audience in absolute hysterics. He runs off stage, mortified, he's crying in the wings, and his brother's saying, come on, we're doing the bows and that sort of thing, come on. And he refuses to go out and give a bow. And then the audience start chanting, and he can hear them from the wings, we want Barnett, Barnett too, Barnett too, Barnett too. And so later he became known, because he obviously gave in and walked on, saw the fun of it, and they became known as the Barnato brothers, the Barnetto, hence Diana Barnato Walker. He goes on to make a huge amount of money in South Africa in the diamond mines, and he uses Barnetto on all the deeds, so therefore that's where Diana's father's money come, because Diana's father is a guy called Wolf Barnetto. Some of you may have heard of him. He was one of the Bentley drivers, very successful racing drivers in the late 19-teens, if that makes sense, and early 1920s. So he is an international racing driver, absolutely fantastic. But weirdly, her parents get divorced. Now, that is really rare. That's almost unheard of. And so she's almost a social outcast as a teenager from her little group. And she has a really sort of thrilling childhood. She's incredibly well off. Like half her family are American, and her grandmother and her are riding in a car in Italy, obviously one day. And this is after premonitions that Diana, if you read her biography, she has this thing. She thinks that she's being guarded by a guardian angel. She always references her guardian angel. And the first time it really appears is in Italy, when the car that she and her grandmother are travelling in goes off the road. It has a crash. It just rolls off the road. And her grandmother, after she's had this dream where she's imagined somebody's going to die and the car rolls over, she's ejected from it. She's just thrown clear of it. And her grandmother is crushed underneath it, which is a hugely traumatizing event. Do you think, given that sort of level of trauma, you wouldn't, because she loved her grandmother very much. And the idea of being in that situation, you'd think you'd get PTSD, but she doesn't. If anything, she's sort of more geared to that sort of life of adventure after that. So much so that when she's sort of 18, she decides she wants to be a pilot. But she just goes along to pilot school, and her first time when she's flying solo, she's flying a thing called a Tiger Moth, which is one of those biplanes, which is basically a basket with an engine on it and two wings, one on top of the other, and about to do her first sort of solo to say that she's a proper pilot now. And a guy who is completely, he has been in a fire, so his face is completely melted. He's got the scars of having suffered huge, third, fourth degree burns. And he comes up and he right up to her while she's about to take off. And he says, don't do it. I flew once. Look what happened to me. This can happen to you. You're a beautiful girl. If you fly, you will end up in a fireball. And, and that sort of, he's screaming at her to stop. And she just goes, oh, well, never mind. And she just takes off and does it anyway. And she doesn't get many flying hours in, but she is one of these people. She said, no, I'm going to do this now, I'm going to do it. And all this time she's going to Monaco, her father's giving her a Bentley for her birthday, incredibly wealthy, beautiful dresses. She's a debutante. She gets presented to the king. You know, she's the elite of the elite. And when you hear her talk and when you read her book, she's just so down to earth and yet gung-ho and happy. And she's in France when the war breaks out. She only just makes it home. After that, she was driving during the Blitz for London Ambulance for the Red Cross. She's trying to, you know, drive all of these pregnant women to the hospital as part of her ambulance work. The whole thing breaks down and she's there trying to repair the engine. She's no idea what she's doing, but she's never gives up. And there's something glorious about that. Also, like, her father does terrible things. Like, he marries this woman, and she first hears about it on a fox hunt when everybody's sort of laughing at her behind her back, saying, oh, your dad's married this one, and she's obviously a gold digger and that sort of thing. And the only reason she found out about it was because everybody saw it on the front page of the paper. There's a lot of trauma, which in her autobiography, she doesn't process as trauma. She processes it as, oh, this funny thing happened, how quaint, and I'm jolly glad it did happen because that allowed me to meet such and such and who and who. Like, her father becomes a wing commander in the RAF, which is presumably how she gets to know some of the boys in the RAF, and they sort of convince her, oh, you've got to give up this ambulance work, come flying for the ATA, it's really good fun, you've had some experience flying. And she had less than 20 hours. She really didn't have much experience at all, but of course she has the network, so I'll let her explain.
But the amount of flying I'd done was about 10 hours, and I hadn't got a license because you had to be 18 then to get a license, and I was only 17 when the war began. And so they said, oh, you ought to get into ATA. They just started taking women in it. They said, you better do a test. So they arranged that somebody called Norman Macmillan, who used to choose the pilots, would come along and see me, and we'd meet as if by chance somewhere. So they said, well, let's meet out riding. So we met in Windsor Park. They took me along, and they sold Norman Macmillan the idea of giving me a flight test, which came off after 2 false starts because it snowed. And I remember the night before my test, I sat on a sofa with one of my flying friends, and we pretended the sofa was a tiger moth because this is what we learned the test was going to be in. And then I was accepted into ATA.
So she just happened to be on a horse and meeting the right man, you know. And the sofa story is very real. That is, you know, many days practicing on a sofa in order to get your flying test. But so they were obviously given flight instruction. And this was wonderful. In the kids' book, I picked the flight instructor called Gribble, because any man called Gribble is going to make a kids' book. I don't really know historically how important Gribble was. He is in Diana's book, Spreading My Wings. But yeah, Diana flew over 80 different types of aircraft, and obviously she couldn't be trained on all 80 of those. So what they did is they broke down the aircraft into different types, and then you started on very small light aircraft and ended on the 4-engine bombers and the seaplanes, and you had a test for each different class of aircraft. So class 1s were things like Swordfish, Tiger Moths, biplanes really, very light single aircraft. Class 2s were fighter planes like Hurricane Spitfires, Mustangs, and so you'd take a test on just one of those. So you take a test on a Mustang or on a Spitfire and be expected to know then how to fly a Hurricane, having never gone in one before, but you were given your pilot's notes, and the ATA provided incredibly detailed pilot's notes. I mean, these handbooks were what they were famous for, as well as really good accident reports, which now sort of make up the industry standard. So Class 2s were the Spitfires. They also included difficult singles like Tomahawks, Typhoons, Tempests, Sea Otters, and the dreaded Walrus. Everybody hated the Walrus. Class 3s were the light twins like the Oxfords, the Whitleys, the Ansons, the Blenheims, those sorts of aircraft which were much larger, had 2 engines, so 2 throttles. Class 4s were the heavy twins, so they're things like the Wellington and the Manchester. Class 4 also included the difficult twins, things like the Hudson and the Marauder. Class 5s were the ones, they had the tricycle undercarriage, so they had 2 rear wheels and 1 front nose wheel. And the difficulty with those was you couldn't land them on a 3-point like you could a Spitfire, who had 2 at the front and 1 at the back. You had to land them back first and then lower the nose, a bit like a modern aircraft that you might have been on, like a Boeing 747, I suppose counts as a tricycle undercarriage. And that included, the big, the Bostons, the Mitchells. And finally, you have Class 6 4-engined aircraft. So you had the Lancaster, the Halifax, the Short Stirling, which were enormous. I mean, I've seen these women not even come up to the top of the tyres of a Short Stirling. It's ridiculous. But they were known as really difficult aircraft to fly. And so they would often get an ATA girl to deliver a Short Stirling to a nervous RAF training school to prove to the men that they could do it too. If a girl can do it, why can't you? And the men would go, oh, they must be easy then. If women can do it, that's fine. And then you have the seaplanes, which women never flew, not because they were incapable of flying them, but because you had to basically spend overnight on a boat with some seamen. And even in those days, you couldn't trust men not to be inappropriate, so the women weren't allowed to fly those planes. But those were the only planes they weren't allowed to fly. And in 1943, they were the first people, the women of the ATA, to be paid equal to men. So men and women were paid the same for the same job, and that's the first time that had happened in British government history. So woohoo! That said, they weren't altogether good people all the time. And I don't mean they weren't good, but they were a little bit naughty. I suppose one of my favourite examples of this were the height requirements. You had to be a certain height to join the ATA, and a lot of them cheated. So I think Diana talks about how she sort of, went on her tiptoes. All of this sort of all these details I do put in Billie Swift Takes Flight, and I had a huge amount of fun working out how you would make yourself a bit taller than you actually would just to be qualified to become a pilot. I mean, it nearly killed her, though, because she was trying to fly a Hampton, which is a twin-engined aircraft, American twin-engine aircraft. She was leaving Thorney Island in it. I think this was in 1943. I mentioned this in the book because in Billie Swift I set it in 1942, and a lot of what Diana does happens in 43 and 44, but I'm saying it's already happened because they're kids, they won't mind, and the stories are true. So, life of a historical fictions author. This is what we do. We lie. Terrible, isn't it? But Diana was leaving Thorney Island in this Hampton, and for whatever reason, normally, you see, it was quite unusual to get, a woman pilot, and they were treated quite nicely because of this. There was this idea that, women pilots are kind of fun and cool and sexy, and you don't get to see many women, and this is a bit of a boon in a man's day. So they're usually quite nice, but the people down at Thorney Island were not particularly nice because she asked for a cushion. And the reason she needed a cushion was because she couldn't physically reach the rudder pedals, because American planes were made basically for orangutans, really long legs and arms. British planes, weirdly, they were much shorter. You have a lot of tall officers complaining that Spitfires were a bit cramped, but for women they're perfect, because women tend to be shorter. For me, not so much. I'm like 6 foot. It would have been a nightmare. I could have reached the rudder pedals of a Hampton, no problem. But what she needed was a couple of cushions behind her so she could physically reach. And they didn't have any cushions. And I don't think they knew why she wanted the cushions. I think that they thought she was being, a bit of a diva and saying, I need cushions because I'm a lady and I need softness and I need to make it look pretty. And it was that sort of level of sexism that they were dealing with. And, Diana just said, okay, fine, I won't have a cushion then. And what she did was quite sensible. She got her parachute, put that behind her, put her notes behind her, and also put her jacket behind her, and thought, that's all right, I can reach the pedals now. But she was only blocking the small of her back. She wasn't blocking her shoulders. So her shoulders could still lean quite far back. And on takeoff, the Hampton, it's got a kick to it. It's like a mule. And so as it takes off, it's a very quick ascent, and it's a twin engine plane. So you've got 2 separate throttles for each engine, 1 on each wing. And what happened was, as she accelerated up, right, she could still reach the rudder pedal because she had part of her back being pushed forward, but her shoulders got pinned back and she could no longer reach the controls, specifically the throttle. Now, there's a little chant that they do, the ATA pilots, which charmingly goes HTTMPPFG, H standing for hydraulics, T standing for trimmers, T standing for throttle friction, M standing for mixture, P standing for pitch, P for petrol, F for flaps, and G for gills. Now, the second T is what we need to concentrate on, and that is throttle friction. And for whatever reason, she hadn't checked the throttle friction, which is a really fun thing to try and say, throttle friction. And what happened was the throttle on one of her engine started to slip. And so it just came back. And of course, if you can imagine, if one of your engines on one wing is going full pelt and the other one slows down, what happens to the plane? It starts to circle as it's taking off, which means it's going to take off and then twist and go straight into the ground. Meanwhile, her stomach muscles are screaming, trying to sit up to reach the throttle, and she physically can't. She's being pinned back in her seat. So what does she do? In this situation, she's almost certainly going to die for want of a cushion. She gets her foot and somehow levers it up and over and kicks the throttle. So literally pushes it with her foot and manages to level the plane out, reach the throttle, and then control it beautifully. I don't know what the men on the ground probably thought, that she was showing off or something, but OMFG, wow. I mean, to keep your head like that. And so many of her near misses, her crashes, are in her autobiography. Another of my favourite stories which involves men is when she flies a Spitfire and she's going to this, to this factory or whatever. No, she's going to an airfield. She's taking it from a ferry pool, and she's taking it back to the RAF. And they're on the way. Because there are rules in the ATA. You can't muck about. You've got to fly below the cloud line because you don't have radio, so you can't get lost. So that's a really good way of making sure you can see where you're going. Also, and you have to fly during the daytime, and you're not allowed to do aerobatics. And of course, you're in a Spitfire. You're going to want to do some aerobatics. And so she thinks, well, look, nobody's looking. I'll just try a roll. So she does, not a loop-de-loop, but she does like a barrel roll where you flip the plane on its side and you basically just pull the rudder and flip it over. And this is brilliant. She flips it over and she's managed to get it over. And the compact that she has, she's got a powder compact in her top pocket, and that falls out of her top pocket and rolls around in the canopy above her, covering it with a powder. So by the time she flips it back, everything is coated with face powder. So everything is dusty, including her hair, her uniform, everything. And when she gets to the RAF base, a man runs up to the Spitfire because he knows a woman's delivered it and he can't wait to meet a female pilot. And then he looks at her and says, "Oh, I heard the really pretty lady was going to deliver this, and it turns out it was a monster." So, that's the sort of level of, it's the important things in the war. Literally, it sounds ridiculous now, but your duty was to look good. There was lipstick commercials saying, "It's your duty to be beautiful, keep young and beautiful." That song is part of the war effort, and it was appropriate for women to dress beautifully. Diana actually had an injury just before she started at the ATA, where she fell off a horse and broke her jaw and had to reset it, and was very self-conscious about her looks. But once again, she sort of takes it in a sort of gung-ho stride and never really complains about it at all. Even though the jaw reset, she looks absolutely beautiful anyway. Of all the stresses, to have that on top, to have this expectation to look a certain way. I mean, I know that she didn't want to parachute out of planes often, because she was wearing the wrong kind of underwear. This is things that you don't think about, which obviously affected the day-to-day life of the female pilots. The whole situation that they were in anyway was so unusual, and having to fly planes that you'd never even been in before. I mean, maybe not even seen before. I mean, I don't know if you've ever rented a car and got in a car you've never driven before and then had to drive it. It's been quite anxiety-making. Well, imagine it's a plane. All of these women, all of these men were doing this. They were just getting in a plane they'd never flown before and flying off with all the things going wrong with it. And when I say all the things going wrong with it, in 1945, she's flying a Typhoon. And as she's flying it, the undercarriage rips off it. So between her legs, the engine's still going, but between her legs, she can see the pedals and the earth hundreds of feet below her. And this alters the stalling speed of the aircraft because, of course, it becomes less aerodynamic once it's got a big hole ripped out of it. And so if you go too slow in it, it's not going to fly at all. It's going to drop like a stone. And she's got to land this thing not knowing, one, if, the undercarriage will hold up enough for the wings to come, the wheels to come down so she can land it, but also she doesn't know the speed. She's going to have to do it at a really high speed. with all of the grass and the dirt and the muck coming up into the cockpit and under her nose and in her eyes, and just the terror of it. And she finds an airfield, she goes in, she lands it, and they're like, what have you done? What have you done to the plane? I said, well, this happened in midair. But she says the Typhoon was the most reliable of all the planes she was in, apart from that one, which nearly took her out entirely. But some of the stories where she's had to make emergency landings, like in a Spitfire, and having to land in this tiny little airfield, which is far too short, with a barrage balloon. And there's another thing that you don't have to worry about now as a pilot, is these wires that can slice your plane in half unless you spot them quickly. But, they have to lower the barrage balloon in order for you to take off. And the runway's too short for a Spitfire to take off. So what she has to do is get all of the ground crew to sit on the wings and hold it back while she revs the engine and gets it all the way up to its maximum rev so they can release the chocks and then all jump off the plane at once so that she can take off really quickly and try and get out of it without hitting the wall at the end of the runway. And this is what she was doing in the daytime. She'd make 2 or 3 deliveries a day, and then her favourite thing to do would be, if she could land in somewhere like White Waltham down near Maidenhead, she could land there, she could get a lift into London, and in London she'd go to a couple of nightclubs, and then she'd leave the nightclub at 4, go to Hyde Park Corner, get a taxi cab, and there's always 1 or 2 taxi drivers she knew by name there. They would take her to the station, and then she'd get the train back down to Hamble, which is where she was based in Southampton, and her car would be parked there. She'd drive her car from the station back to her house, eat breakfast, and then spend another day delivering planes without having any sleep, probably still being quite drunk. It's an unbelievable life that these women are living. A lot of them, they feel guilty because, quite selfishly, they didn't want the war to end. They were having this amazing life. They were living, away from their parents, risking their lives quite seriously. There were a lot of fatalities, but despite this, there were a lot of adventures. The one that I managed to get into Billie Swift, which isn't the way it happened, was the story. I mean, they did fly a plane quite illegally to Ireland. I mean, not illegally. They borrowed a plane. They didn't steal it. They borrowed it. They flew to Ireland where there wasn't any meat rationing, filled it with turkeys, and then distributed the turkeys to all of their mates in the ATA. So... because obviously, rationing, it didn't matter how much money you had. You couldn't get the meat if you didn't have coupons. And Diana was very naughty because her big thing was, once D-Day had happened and the Normandy landings and all of the rest of it, once the, Americans and the Britons were in France, were in Belgium and fighting the Nazis on that front, that meant that the deliveries had to start happening into Europe. And at first they wouldn't let the women go at all. It was just the men in the ATA flying the planes over to Belgium. And this annoyed Diana's husband, Derek. So Derek Walker she met, and they fell in love, and it was rather sweet. If you read her autobiography, it's very sweet. He decides that he's got a job. He's a RAF officer. He needs to deliver 2 Spitfires. Why can't he acquisition Diana to take the other Spitfires? So they both fly over to Belgium, have an absolutely lovely time. And then the weather changes and they can't leave. And she needs to leave because she's promised the 80 days. She's got to get back. He's got to get back as well. He's an RAF officer. He can't be in Belgium all this time. They were meant to be in Belgium. It was fine, but only for like a day. It's been 3 days. The weather's still bad. So he says, right, what we're going to do is you're going to stay on my wing. We're going to fly together. You're going to keep an eye on me because you can't read the radar and your plane doesn't have radio or anything. Here, so we'll fly back. Just stick close to me. But the RAF and the ATA have different flight speeds and they have different rules about how to fly. And Diana is in a plane she's not entirely familiar with because it is a Spitfire, but it's also a spy plane. So it's got all of these different switches and things. She's not 100% sure about it. And she's made mistakes like this in the past. I mean, once she was on, I can't remember which plane it was now, but it'd been fitted with a new button, which as she was just working out, she just pressed it and it turned out to be a petrol jettison button. So she soaked the ground crew beneath her in petrol and they had to, because they couldn't get a tractor because they couldn't risk a spark, they had to physically drag it, like push it themselves onto somewhere which was dry and safe for them to continue working for it. And this is when petrol was rationed, so she must have wasted, more petrol than she probably used it in the war in her car far on this one little accident because it wasn't in her pilot's notes. The ATA pilot's notes hadn't been updated. And had she done it in the air, that would have been the end of her. But, she she did it. There's loads of things. The worst one was people who confused. There's two different cranks in a Spitfire, and one allows it to cool down, so it opens up the flaps and stop the engine from overheating, and the other retracts the undercarriage. And there's been quite a few people who've retracted the undercarriage of a Spitfire that's on the ground and it's just smashed. Crashing it whilst it's stationary is a particular skill. Anyway, so she is on the wing of her husband and she's hoping that he's going to go, no, the weather's really bad, I can't see through the muck, this is absolutely terrible, let's just go back. But he doesn't, and so she follows him. Remember, she doesn't have a map, and then in the fog his plane just disappears. And now she is in a plane somewhere in Belgium. She's got a compass in the plane. She knows what height she is, but that's it. Remember, there are still pockets of Nazis fighting throughout the country beneath her somewhere. So she can't risk landing because she might end up as a prisoner of war. She carries on flying from it. She swoops down low. She sees she's above water. Okay, is that the Channel? Is that further south? Is she going Atlantic or is it North Sea? She has to work out where she is. Bless her. This is the most terrifying thing you could be in, where you don't know where you are. You've got a certain amount of fuels. You've got to get back to England. You've got to get back to an airfield. Fortunately, this is 1944, so she knows by this point the layout of the land, so that when she does finally glimpse a bit of coastline, she immediately goes to it and she can see that it's Britain, and she knows exactly where she is because she recognises it by eye, because that's how she's been getting around all this time. And she manages just to pick out different landmarks. She follows the rivers and finds an airfield. And this is the only airfield, it's up near Taunton, the only airfield in the entire UK that's still open. And she thinks that all of the lights it's got going on are because, somewhere, some RAF, there's a big fleet of them and they're going to come in, and this is why all the lights are on. The lights are on for her, and she doesn't know because Derek has already landed at this place and is just going, oh my goodness, just light everything up so she can see. And she lands it, and he's there, utterly white with fear. Just go, how on earth did you find it? And she just goes, it's my guardian angel, it's fine. She's incredible. But this makes the papers, this flying couple, having a holiday, it seems, and it's very, very unpopular. And I think it gets brought up in Parliament. It's a bit seen as a big deal. But after that, women are allowed to fly to Belgium. And every time she goes without her parachute. She takes her parachute out, fills her parachute bag up with chocolate. It's exactly 32 tins to fill your parachute bag. Stuff it with chocolate. Weirdly, the UK had a surfeit of chocolate and no sugar. And so she would then sell the chocolate when she was on the continent and have a lovely time on the proceeds, really lovely party, fill it up with contraband, like sweets and cheese and all the things that she wanted, like leather and shoes and things like that, and then fly back. She admits to all of this in her book. I'm not grassing her up. Later on, like I say, after the war, she and the loss of her husband, she continues to fight for female aviation. She teaches women how to fly, and because she is so charming and so well connected, she manages to wrangle things that shouldn't be easily wrangled. She is most famed not for any of the stuff I've talked about right now, but for something she did in 1963. On the 26th of August, she got to fly an English Electric Lightning T-14 because she just happened to be in just the right place. She'd been teaching throughout the day. She was teaching the Women's Junior Air Corps in RAF Middleton St George. One weekend, she had dinner and then went to the officers' mess, and several of the pilots of the Lightning conversion course, which is the Lightning jet, were sort of talking about there. And the wing commander, who's a guy called John de M. Severing, suggested that she fly one of their Lightnings, and nothing she'd rather do, thank you very much, but she needed to make it official. And he was like, oh, well, do you know anybody? And she went, let me think, the Air Minister. I know the Air Minister. Previously, she'd been blocked from this because she couldn't get insurance, because I think it was a Meteor she wanted to fly, which she'd flown for the ATA, but obviously not at the top speed, and breaking the sound barrier was one of the things that she really wanted to do because no woman had done it yet. She arrived early at the ministry on a Monday wearing her smartest uniform, and she had on her a little card where she'd written 12 reasons why she wanted to fly the Lightning, because she was so nervous she could have forgotten them. And she goes in his office office and he's there and he says nothing. He just reaches on his desk and pressed a bell, and in came a smart wing commander, and he asked him to take the letter and said, "She wants to fly a Lightning." And the wing commander looked suitably surprised. The emissary went, "Well, I don't see why she shouldn't." And there you go. And so when she got into the Lightning, she obviously became a member of the 10-ton club because she flew at over 1,000 miles an hour, and she beat Jackie Cochrane's previous record, and she'd flown at Mach 1.65, which is 1,262 miles an hour. Absolutely incredible. So she got these opportunities simply because of how well connected she was, and it just goes to show how she expected not to be allowed to do things because of her sex. And that is a real reminder as to how things were in the not too distant past. And of course, you know, she was incredibly privileged. At the same time, that privilege was also hard won. Her father being an amazing racing driver, her family having split up, her princess-like teenage years ruined by not only the breakout of war, but also the divorce of her parents and her father remarrying, and also her childhood, you know, witnessing that trauma of seeing her grandmother crushed, and at the same time this, you know, losing her first fiancé in a very sad accident, which was, you know, self-inflicted, and then losing her husband, who she dearly loved, not remarrying again, vowing never to, having an affair with a married man, having a child with him. But at the same time, amongst all of this apparent disorder, amongst the bombs falling in the Second World War, where she is literally an ambulance driver in the Blitz, somehow her guardian angel keeps her safe, and somehow we have her story. And I'm just so happy that I get to tell it to children. If you want to find out more about the ATA and the women there, I really recommend reading my own book, which is Billie Swift Takes Flight. It is a bit of children's fiction, but it is a lot of fun. And also, every single accident that happens in that book is real. Admittedly, not in the right time or the right people doing the accident, but I tried to base it as much as I can on the real lives and real adventures of these women. Do check out iszi.com, Iszi.com, if you'd like to read that. But if you know any short people, you can order a signed copy off my website. All of the good bookshops have it. It's published by Bloomsbury. But Diana Barnato Walker's life is incredibly mixed, full of privilege, full of trauma, full of characters, and full of pluck. And really, she is the epitome of everything that the ATA stood for.
There was everybody. There were millionaires to dustmen. We had 2 conjurers. We had 2 bookmakers. There was everybody, every walk of life. And all these people, all age groups, some were 60, some were 18, way down the age scale. And they all were melded together into what became an extremely efficient organization. So that at one time, every aircraft flown by the RAF had previously been delivered by the ATA. By an ATA pilot.
You've been listening to the Z-List Deadlist podcast with me, Iszi Lawrence. To find out more, please visit Iszi.com, that is ISZI.com. To support the show, please share this episode with your friends or support me on Ko-Fi. So that's ko-fi.com/Iszi Lawrence, where you can buy me a coffee. Go to Iszi.com, you'll find all the links. Billie Swift Takes Flight is out on the 2nd of September 2021. Do have a read. I'm quite proud of it.